Let me start with a question for Janet and Tim. Last week was a pretty intense political week in American society. There have been similar kind of developments in European societies and so forth. But how do we get back to civility? And leave Kavanaugh out of this for the moment. But on the issue of climate change, where we become apparently so polarized, and this is a week where Florida gets hit for a second time, and Carolinas get hit for a second time. So, Janet, start off, help us understand the mechanics and the way we can become more civil and get the discourse, differences aside, get the discourse back down to...
Well, first and foremost, I think speaking to this audience is an incredible privilege, and the fact that we work with young people is where we need to start. The investment is strong there. We are more likely to change minds and have individuals be malleable, not to necessarily change their own opinions, but if they can change their opinions about one another, we're more likely to be able to cultivate leaders who are able to problem solve together. What you're addressing, obviously, is a very complex, a wicked problem with so many levels of dysfunction in terms of how do we remove the partisanship from an issue. But I think there's a ton of areas, and I don't want to belabor them, but the fact that we need a 100% litmus test for our leaders and politicians today is extremely problematic. If we want to solve environmental problems, the array of political issues in which we disagree with someone should not matter. Also, the concept of political wins, allowing, quote, the other side to get a win. You know, welfare reform doesn't happen under a Republican government. It happens under a Democratic. So really thinking about the base and where those changes need to take place and allowing, quote, the other side to have a political win. And also just having the premise of negotiations in good faith. But there are so many issues in terms of our politics today, and obviously the leaders we elect, you know, for instance, you know, Congress has a 9% approval rating, but I bet the folks in this room feel pretty good about their person or their senator, and that's a real paradox that very much relates to the work. If we have 10 to 12 years to solve this issue in environmental education, we actually have half that time to solve this issue in democracy.
You bet. Tim, from your perspective, how would you?
Yeah, first of all, and let me thank everyone for showing up today. This is the town where I was raised, so this is a kind of a homecoming for me. It's great to be back in Spokane, and this river was trash when I was growing up, so this is a remarkable development just right in front of us here. It's a great question. You know, what happened is we went really tribal in the last 4 to 8 years. Mm-hmm. We, you know, America is an idea, and it really is an audacious idea. Almost every other country is about nationalism, what tribe, what ethnic group you're from. We threw all that out, and we're about an idea. We're not about, you know, where you came from, what your background is, what your religious belief is. Almost every other nation is based on those tribal things. We're not. We're based on an idea. Now, we're in a period now where we're going tribal. We're going back to those sides. But here's the thing about the environment. We all breathe the same air. We all drink the same water. We are, what started the environmental movement, one of the things that started it, was that iconic picture of the Earth rise, taken from the moon. And people saw this thing and they said, oh my God, we're on this tiny little orb and we all share this thing together. Look at that little blue orb, you know, to picture from the moon. And it shocked a lot of people into realizing we inhabit this tiny little thing. Well, that's what we're seeing now with the convulsions of this Earth that are climate change. And I think what will get us out of the incivility, I mean, you can go tribal and you can argue over guns, you can argue over, you know, welfare, you can argue over taxes and what your marginal tax rate should be. All those things are things on which people can break down. But the commonality is this orb. And I think what you see with the catastrophic effects we're seeing of climate change right now are making people realize that commonality. So I think civility will come as it forces us to realize we are on this tiny little thing together. In other words, we're going to go back to what started the environmental movement on this.
Janet, what a follow-up question for you. My recollections of Ronald Reagan were, and I voted as a Democrat, but one of my recollections of him that was so powerful was how congenial he was. Could you say any word about presidential style, and how does a president unify? And
well, first I want to be critical about the way we look at presidents. How a president is lionized is very much the sign of the times as well, and I want to be very honest and upfront about that. And presidential libraries, by their nature, and presidential foundations and institutes carry out and preserve and promote the legacy of the president. So we're proud to do that work because we believe it is the last civic thread and fabric that unifies a nation that has become so siloed. Really, you grew up in the Clinton era, you grew up in the Reagan era, you remember 9/11. These are things that are tied to certain presidents. I think, though, a piece of the presidential legacy that we really look to, and in our conference room in Washington, D.C., we have 4 pictures, one with President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, one with Margaret Thatcher, one with Pope John Paul II, and one with Tip O'Neill. And in that photo, they are laughing as only jovial Irishmen can laugh, belly full of, and they fought long and hard battles. And President Reagan had 8 years of a Democratic Congress. And I'm not going to say that they hugged it out the entire time, because that would be completely false. But they got work done, and it really resonated with me. Speaking of our last week's political fury that was going on, Senator Coons and Senator Flake were at an event together. And they got a standing ovation. Yeah. And I'll admit, I actually had a little tear in my eye. I was like, oh gosh, this is so fantastic. And then 5 hours later, the cynical side of me came to, and I said, I just got emotional over the fact that 2 elected members of our Senate are willing to work together. So what kind of bar have we set for ourselves that we're allowing ourselves to, we're not incentivizing the people we put into leadership to compromise. We say, hey, you did not vote 100% with me, so I'm going to find a challenger who is more far right or far left, and I'm going to replace you. So we actually vilify them when they're shaking hands with members of the opposite side of the aisle, or if they're seen with someone. And really, we, the politics that we have, it's not our fault, but it is our responsibility. And we really need to think of ways to incentivize people to work together, to find common ground, to take 40% when you're in the minority, to take 60% when you're in the majority, and really get to a point where we can work together.
That's a great answer. One of the things that is, to me, most disturbing about this era, and it's not necessarily left or right, it's just characteristic, but it's this whole issue of fake news. If we can't point to a body of data and reality that we can collectively believe in, it's the old Patrick Moynihan's point about you can select your ideas and so forth, but you can't choose your facts. Those are so. Okay, how do we take a generation of younger people that are now electronically very savvy in some ways, and make them skeptical of what they see on screens? So you work at Tufts, you work with young people, you work with technology and so forth. Tell us, what's the game plan for bringing some kind of order out of this fake news era, which we're not sure what we believe anymore because everything is kind of up for grabs?
I was afraid you'd ask that, because I think everybody's...
I can go to another question
I really was hoping it wouldn't come to me. But, I think everybody's really looking for solutions, because frankly, both on the ground and on sort of the, academia, both parties are in a way at loss about how to do that exactly. I think some of the solutions have come out that, in fact, some of these critical thinking skill does help, and these things are teachable, so that's helpful. But the challenge is that both the sources of information keep evolving in terms of the variety of it and how polarized they have become as field. And then the educators who are not really keeping up with the young people themselves in the evolution of social media really have no grasp on that. So there are young people in their classroom, let's say this is high school. Teachers are trying to teach, sourcing of information, how to think critically, but they don't know what kids are reading. Because they can keep up. So it's a fast-moving target, and none of us seems to know what to do with that. One of the recent conversations that I was in, it was a group of people that really talked about news and media and young people and sort of what to do next. And we talked about how, in a way, we need to start much, much, much earlier than we do now. In thinking about information literacy and news literacy, we often do that in high school, maybe in humanities. We need to do that from much earlier, like elementary school, and start with really the idea that everything is a question. It's an inquiry that we can take the journey through different sources of information and different perspective. And information is for discovery rather than confirmation of something that we already believe. And if we start that early, before kids actually have ideas about what is the world or what it's supposed to be, we thought that perhaps we can start to form a different path.
It's interesting. Can I follow that up and raise, this is not on our list, so this is beyond, we haven't thought about this. I wonder, Kay is at Tufts University, great school. When kids come into Tufts, they're well-trained, they're wonderful kids, and so you have something to work with. What about other parts of the United States or the world where people are not that sophisticated, and education may not have served them very well? And the rule, I'm told, is that for every person on this side of the screen, there are 1,000 people on this side of the screen trying to keep them hooked into the screen. That's addiction. And so the question to all of you, if you want to take this on, is in a world where technology can be addictive and can be pernicious, how do you keep a democracy? What are the rules here? And this is a big, far-ranging question. I'm not sure we have an instant answer to it, but how do we
Well, Kay actually has a plethora of knowledge about civic deserts and the work that she's done out of Circle to describe the pockets of really access that we have, the coast, and you stop in Chicago sometimes, right? And then we make massive blanket assumptions about how Americans are based on these cities and really lack the understanding that there are entire areas of the country that are lacking broadband and don't have access to information and can't go to a presidential library or an art museum.
Right.
So these civic deserts are real critical areas that we need to address. And ultimately, our education system as well, it's not just environmental education, is archaic, and I use that language kindly, but the reason why many students can't see themselves in this space or don't see themselves as actors in terms of civic actors is they're learning English for 1 hour and they're not to do anything besides English, and then they do math. And as a social studies teacher, I remember I'd have our students add up their grades and they're always like, "This isn't math class, miss." And we've trained them to be in this world. We were talking earlier about these false binaries. We're not going to get out of this mess through multiple choice. And yet, every single young person is told there's a right answer. And in our daily lives, there's not a right answer. Oftentimes, we're presented with 10 really terrible answers, and you have to do the critical thinking, as Kay says, to get out of that problem. And sometimes it's still a very terrible decision that you made at the end of the day.
So one just side part of our addiction to digital information, the dopamine loop that we're all in whenever we send a tweet out or a text. I'm sure everyone in this room is familiar with what's called nature deficit syndrome. And there's been a pretty good book written about it. It's still speculative. I mean, it hasn't been entirely proven, but it's basically, we're wired as warm-blooded mammals to love nature, but our devices are taking us away from that. So many people, I mean, one of the things, I think the North Cascades Institute is here, and one of the things they're doing is getting kids who've never had any exposure to the outdoors suddenly being exposed to nature, because it's not going to go away just because we're a generation of people addicted to our stuff. That's a side thing. Now, on the fake news part of it, so Facebook right now, it deservedly is in a lot of trouble. I mean, they allowed their social media platform to be just totally weaponized to not only really attack democracy, but kill people. I mean, in other parts of the world right now, Facebook has been used to say awful things that is leading to slaughter. So they're saying, well, we're going to hire, first they said we're hiring 500 people. Then they say we're going to hire 1,000. Now, the latest I heard is something like, we're going to hire 20,000 people to go through all the Facebook pages. Oh, here's a picture of my dog and my kid. Oh, and here's something from InfoWars. Oops, got to take that out. Like they're going to go through and just screen. Yeah. I'm here to tell you, you could hire 50,000 people, and it's not going to keep Facebook from being weaponized to get terrible stuff into the bloodstream. What has to happen is what you spoke of, and what you raised. You have to teach critical thinking. So some European countries right now are teaching high school kids how to tell fake news from real news. It's not that difficult. It goes to sourcing. I mean, people should be able to tell the difference between InfoWars and the Associated Press. It's not that difficult. So they're requiring it in the schools in some of the European countries. So I think the solution is, or a solution, there's never the solution, but a solution is, again, not to hire zillions of people to go through everyone's Facebook pages and screen out all the garbage. The garbage is still going to get in there, but to teach the critical thinking at the front end.
And the tools, ultimately, tools are amoral by nature. It is us, we're responsible for how we deliver these tools. And that's the tough part, right? When we see a tool that's delivered in a way that is weaponized, the responsibility is on us. But, we should address the teacher workforce out there that, has not had the training or the comfort to utilize that, which Kay was speaking about earlier. And, I hope that I'm not alone in the fact that, as the teacher, sometimes I was very uncomfortable when, all of my students knew how to set up my smartboard and I was like, reset, like maybe I'll just replug this thing in, And, here I am, I'm very invested in education technology. And then there are teachers who are closer to the end of their tenure and they don't know how to address these needs. They can't discern these sources. There are still tons of teachers out there who think, Wikipedia is unreliable when we know that it is, more up to date than their old encyclopedia that's sitting up there on the shelf. So, and this is not to play the blame game. That it's clearly a profession that is under fire and undercompensated, and apparently no one wants to go into anymore. But we really need to support this next generation of young teacher leaders to be able to discern information from fact and fiction. But I also want to, throw out the nuance that there's obvious fake news and then there's biased news, and really being able to say, some of these instances when an individual who already believes what fake news is, sees biased news, they're going to double down and put their heels in. And also to someone on the right and the left, when you say fake news, they mean entirely different things. So we may be using the same lexicon, but we have entirely different meaning, and that's very critical in terms of preserving our democracy.
Can I complicate it just one more layer?
No.
So it's true, Tim. I think there are sources that are really solid, has really trained journalists that has, checking sources, multiple interviewees and all that. But then there's conversation about engaged journalism, right? Where, for example, communities of color have often disengaged from some of these mainstream news because they don't see themselves portrayed. There are no writers that represent their communities. So I've heard many times that our community have sort of just checked out of that system. So how do we bring them back and then emotionally engage students of all backgrounds, or even young adults of all backgrounds, to feel like their news means something, instead of it's these things that, for example, white people are talking about have nothing to do with them. And that's been a struggle for me. So how do you sort of have a different journalism so that journalism itself is more engaging to a broader range of people?
Well, actually, one of the good things to happen with the web is it did bring down the barriers. I mean, you really can have, and it's good and bad. I mean, you can have someone sitting at home in their jammies, tweeting out to an audience of 500,000 people. That person could tweet out brilliant, genius, enlightening things.
Totally.
Or that person could tweet out awful, untrue, horrible things. But what you've seen with the web is these niches are all developing. So groups that were underrepresented when we only had, Lyndon Johnson famously said, "I've lost Walter Cronkite, therefore I've lost the Vietnam War." Well, you could never say that now because we have a plethora of voices. I think the underserved voices have been helped by the technology of the web because the barriers are down.
Right.
There still are half a dozen mainstream media's outlets. Now, by the way, it's a relatively new thing to not have a partisan press. Yeah. I mean, we started with vicious partisanship. The paper you read called Thomas Jefferson every name in the book, or
John
praised
Adams
him as
was accused of being a hermaphrodite in 1800.
Exactly. I mean, Abraham Lincoln used to complain about this. It's only really in basically the dawn of the 20th century we got a quote professional press with the wire service and things like that. So in some ways we're going back to that bifurcated partisan era. So I don't know. I mean, but I don't want to discourage anyone. I really want people to leave this meeting encouraged that these are not intractable problems, because really you can teach critical thinking, you can teach people to discern. Now there are other arguments about it, the underserved areas, but I don't want people to think, oh God, I just have to turn my back on it. No, I think it's a relatively easy thing to teach people how to separate, well, I can't use the word I'm going to use. Crap from information.
Yeah. Yeah, good. How many of you, by the way, are, just a quick show of hands, how many of you are classroom teachers? Let's see your hands.
Oh, a lot.
How many of you work through nature centers or zoos or other kind of organizations?
Oh, wow.
Okay, the question is this. You all are involved in this big thing we call environmental education. And I don't think there's ever been a good definition of it quite that works for me. But Alfred North Whitehead, in a book written in 1925, said that the key of education is to get young people to fall in love with the world. Mm-hmm. And Tim mentioned Rich Lou's work, Last Child in the Woods and so forth, and his organization called the Children and Nature's Network. I'm on the board of that, but working with kids to get kids outside. So the conversation so far has been about critical education and what electronic media have done to that. It makes it more difficult. It makes it in some ways better and easier. But what's the balance for you three of the time spent outdoors, falling in love with nature, whether it's hiking with grandma or with your kids out in the woods or whatever it might be, but outdoors, and mostly unsupervised activity. And then the work of critical education. This is a nitpicky question in a way, because critical thinking skills, is that our job, or what part of that is our job as environmental educators? Does that make sense? How do we build environmental education that works, that they fall in love with the natural world and are presumably encouraged thereby to become competent and loving and so forth? And the point that I'm making relative to democracy is, I don't think we're going to save much of nature unless we really do love it. Enough of us love it and engage in the political arena. So any thoughts about how we construct curricula that does all of this kind of stuff? Or what do we not do?
Well, as a teacher, you could start. And as ex-teacher.
I'm happy to start. I mean, my teaching career is probably not the norm. I chose to teach at John C. Fremont High School in South Central Los Angeles. And, my first year I had 68 students and 30 chairs. And, there was rodents and all sorts of living insects that were not children in my room. So it's not the norm. And, the tragedy of these students' lives involved trauma. And the lack of access, and they lived 15 minutes from the beach, and they'd never been on the highway before. So I think in many ways, one of the flaws of any sort of movement, and I'll just relate it to what I know, which is civic engagement, is we tend to lord our education over people, and we don't know it. It's unintentional. But I will, from personal experience, my father and mother don't have a second grade education combined, and they were some of the most intelligent people I knew, but, I could not convince my father to save my life that electricity is a scarce resource. It just blew his mind. He was like, there's no way I'm going to leave my lights on forever. It's all a matter of money, right? To really explain and lord, the privilege of education over others is, I think, where we have that snapping point, where we aren't able to communicate to others that preserving, the environment, preserving resources is something worth doing, because it is an affront to their dignity. So I would say for that piece, for the students that I taught, there was an incredible lack of dignity, and to tell them that there are these beautiful places out there, well, they never had access to it. They don't see it, they don't feel it, they don't know it. So for them to really look at this from a theoretical approach is not only is harmful, but it's also demeaning. So I suppose that's a different perspective than many schools, but that is the reality for a lot of schools in urban areas, and I know you were a teacher as well.
Yeah, I think that, to your point, David, probably everyone in this room at some point, if not a moment, there was a time where you sort of had a connection to nature. Mm-hmm. It could be just a sunrise, or it could be, you went on a hike, or it could be catching a fish. Everybody has, ocean, I mean, everybody has a moment where you feel this sort of visceral connection to it. The second thing is you want to defend it after you feel the connection to it. Now, for me, it was this river out here. I mean, I was a kid. This thing was a garbage dump. It had tires in it. There were dead fish floating by. It was no one would go near it. They didn't have a walkway along here. You had industrial tracks and garbage. And it was a dead river almost. And I love nature. I mean, my family, we had a big Irish Catholic family. We'd go camping in the public lands, and my mother was like, we own this land. This is beautiful. This is part of us. This is part of the American endowment as a public landowner. And then I'd come back and I'd look at this trashed river. This is central to the Native Americans who lived here. This is their sacred site. We just completely trashed it, this heart going through. And so I went from love of nature to wanting to defend it. And I think everybody makes those connections. You can't teach those connections. Now, the disconnect is what you spoke of. So 2 years ago was the 100th anniversary of the national parks establishment. National Geographic asked me to do this cover story on will millennials save the parks? Like they're going to be disconnected from nature. And so, I floated down the Grand Canyon with my kid, and we had no Wi-Fi. And it was really hard for him initially, the first 3 days. It's like, God! He was just going through withdrawal. And then by day 5, he was over it. I kind of broke him. And I was missing a lot of stuff too, I'll admit. But my conclusion was that human beings don't change. Millennials aren't any different from boomers, from the silent generation, from the greatest generation, from the generation that's going to fall. Devices have changed us somewhat, but if you give people a chance to make that connection, they will make it. That's why humans haven't changed. So what happened was, at the end of 2016, they had the greatest record-breaking year ever of visitation to the national parks. And under President Obama and through his Interior Secretary, Sally Jewell, they did this real concerted effort to get kids into the parks who wouldn't normally go to the parks. The kids you spoke of who live 10 minutes from a national recreation area and didn't know this thing existed. The kids where I live in Seattle who can see Mount Rainier but had never been within that park before. And so they had a concerted effort. And once they got them to be exposed to that, the connections started to happen.
Interesting.
So who solved, or who are the players that made this river beautiful again? Because I think those are where we find our solutions at a local level.
So interestingly, they had a World's Fair. And the World's Fair theme was the environment. And they couldn't host it with this crappy river in the middle here. So they said, we better clean this thing up. And coincidentally, the greatest environmental laws of our time were now working. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Environmental Protection Agency was up and going. The Endangered Species Act was going. So there were all these laws to impact, that basically said they had to clean it up. And that's, what's the river in Ohio that caught fire? Cuyahoga. You would know this better than I.
You would have to bring that up.
Right.
Repeatedly caught fire.
Right.
So, I'm a big fan of experiential education, and I think environmental education does a superb job of that. But I want the kids to also have means to addressing some of these environmental justice and things that need to be fixed. And that's where sort of civic education or political education come in, to really equip the kids with an ability to love and resist that change that's starting to occur to our Earth, right? Whether it's a really local watershed or it's much bigger sort of a climate, atmospheric change. But I think for kids that are, not just adults, but smaller kids, I think it's really about the small local thing that they can start to notice. Right. And I live in an urban environment too, and kids don't see sunset, and kids don't really see anything nature-ish. But it's really about having them, or giving them an eye to notice the nature in everyday life. So I think it's about, I tell them to dig up the worms in the dirt that we have, in a little patch of land we have, and that's nature, right? And they're amazed by how they move and how they dig into the sand, and all these things are part of the nature, and it's beautiful. But unless they have somebody that can tell them that, whether it's through educational institution or a community of mentors that they can come with, I think we can't really get to everybody. But I do believe the nature world is everywhere. So it's really about sort of how do we take advantage of everything that we have so far, so that every kid can realize that it's for them too, to really care about the environment, and then equip them all with the skills and disposition of civic actor to be able to really protect that together.
Judy, how are we doing time-wise?
About 8 minutes to questions.
8 minutes to Q&A. Okay, so I'm going to ask this. Should we, in environmental education, get at the causes. So you can see the symptoms. There are dirty air and whatever and forest fires. You can see all the symptoms. So if we get serious about causes, then we have to talk about income distribution. We have to talk about the form of the economy. And we do have, as Kay pointed out, we have to talk about injustice. And is there a direct correlation between injustice on one side and the fact that you've got, what's the number? You can put, 10 people on the stage here and they've got more net wealth than the bottom 2/3 of humankind or whatever. I mean, you know that it's totally out of whack. So all this injustice, should we teach that? Should we get into the battle between, let's say, neoliberal economics and ecological economics? Should we talk about income distribution? Should we talk as citizens of the United States about the fact that, roughly 30% of the carbon in the atmosphere historically came from us? So if you think of the atmosphere as a big bucket, we filled up a pretty good chunk of that bucket. And now we're telling other people you gotta. So how much of this? Do you all want to get into this? We can stay on less controversial topics, but this is politics.
No, I think ultimately we were actually speaking about this prior to the panel, Tim and I, about what are some of the sort of obstacles towards addressing controversial issues, and we live in a very litigious society. For those attendees who are not part of American society, you're probably not going to run into the same problems, but teachers are discouraged, sometimes oppressed when trying to raise controversial issues. So the answer, I think, is that yes, we do need to speak about it, but speaking about controversial issues and critical issues in a manner that does not impose our own thinking. I will say, even today, students will message me on Facebook and ask who I should vote for. The amount of power that we have over our students is not something to take lightly, this responsibility that we've been given. And I think, not to say that there's a political bent to our teaching, but just to be mindful of our biases, because oftentimes we think we're empowering our students, but sometimes we are carpetbaggers to their life, and just being very, it's a difficult road to travel, but ultimately we do need to protect the professions. And when you were speaking about how do we get students to love nature? Our school systems are some of the least democratic places we can live in. So it's not a surprise that our young people come out not prepared for democracy because they're told to sit for 8 hours a day in chairs. And I remember taking a small group of AP students, well-behaved students, outside to teach a lesson, and they're like, "Get back inside. That's not safe." These are things. How can we create critical thinkers when the school system is structured in a manner that is I guess authoritarian, to be unkind? Yeah,
in a place like Ohio where it's hard for teachers to stray very far into issues that are philosophical or political or even smack of anything about the underlying causes of this. Tim, you work for that failing paper.
Actually, we're doing great under Trump. So,
yeah, the rumor on the street is that you were part of his election.
Right.
Good for a business plan. How do you? Where is the balance in this? In the public, the national public discourse?
Well, first of all, I want to go back to your earlier question because it's a great one, and answer it yes. You have to teach. You have to talk about. I look at this, the way I look at it, is the public health model. Mm-hmm. We have an opioid crisis right now. It's killing more people, more Americans every year than all the people who were killed in the Vietnam War. Okay, more than 50,000 people, fellow Americans, are dying of opioid addiction, overdose, et cetera. So we have to talk about the larger things that's causing the opioid crisis, obviously, and that's the public. My daughter's a master's in public health, and she's got me thinking about this. The way you look at public health emergencies, epidemiology, what's the underlying cause? So this summer, there was a very riveting thing happening. Everybody in this room saw it. You saw that orca in Puget Sound pushing along the poor dead baby calf, and this painful thing of a highly intelligent creature unwilling to let go this dead baby. And it got a lot of people thinking, well, why did the orca die? Why is this pod starving to death? They are starving to death, that pod in Puget Sound. Well, because the ocean is acidifying because of climate change, and there aren't enough there isn't enough food. And also, what do they eat? Well, they eat salmon. Why are we losing salmon? Well, because these salmon can't get up the Columbia River because there are dams there. So it got people to look at it wasn't just, oh, my heart goes out. It started with, my heart goes out to this poor mother orca grieving, it was like 14 days where she pushed that dead calf along Puget Sound. It was riveting. This is a #1 thing, even on the New York Times website. The video was, people wanted to watch this thing. But the follow-up questions to get your thing, the underlying cause thing, became very crucial. And I think it's insane, not insane, it's imperative that when you talk about environmental issues, you talk about causes underlying them. And again, my example is the orca. So I would say overwhelmingly, yes, talk about the underlying things. And if they're controversial, I mean, my heart goes out to any teacher, really, because they get it from so many sides. They get it from top, they get it from the bottom, and then they don't get paid enough to get it from all those sides either.
It's not fun.
But that doesn't mean you shy away from it. I mean, it's easier for me to say because I'm a journalist and I just, I'm an opinion writer as well, which is even easier. So it is easy for me to say, but I think we have to teach the underlying causes.
I thought it was a rhetorical question when you're asking that. Of course, I totally get the kind of the hardship on the ground. I hear enough about it, both from out-of-school educators as well as in-school teachers. But I think without that, we can't really do anything. And I think we forget to demand that from our students, as well as adults, to be self-critical, as well as critical of people that have a different opinion. So critical thinking skill doesn't just mean you evaluate the sources, other people's opinions, say, yep, something's wrong with what your argument is. But it's really about where do I come from? How did my opinions form? And do I really have a stand here? And I think that's when we start to be able to address some of these polarization problem. Without that skill to both critically address your own views as well as what's happening in the world from the root cause, we can't really come together and understand the common cause that's oftentimes not that polarizing.
Before we turn to you all, we've got an election in the United States coming up in, 29 days or whatever?
We do?
Who's counting?
Sort of. I
26 days.
But who's
26
counting,
days.
right?
Quick question, just this kind of a more or less answer. Does environmental education make a difference in that vote right now? This election coming up in November, are we a big factor, small factor, irrelevant? Or however else you want to describe it. Janet, you want to?
Complex question. I think,
I just look for a simple answer,
education in general is, and this is something that we address at the Reagan Foundation Institute when we look at education policy and education reform, is that people say, speaking of paradoxes, right? They want clean air, they want clean rivers, and then but people say education is a priority. But if you look at how voters decide, where they check out, it's a non-factor. It is not a player. So education in general is actually a non-player when it comes to people's electoral decisions. What I would say in terms of the vantage point of the work that we do is, we chase President Reagan's call for what he asked for in his farewell address, which is, quote, an informed patriotism. And it's almost prophetic if you ever want to Google it. He says he's really proud of that resurgence in national pride that took place during his 8 years in office, but that feeling wouldn't get us very far as a country. That it'd have to be those critical questions, not memorizations of dates in history, but actually the informed patriotism piece, actually encouraging young people to ask their parents questions around the dinner table. And I think that love of country is going to be the piece that is able to translate to the love of the earth, right? We can't possibly sit there and have these paradoxes where we don't have a respect for our country and the democratic processes and institutions, in spite of the fact that we feel that they're failing many of us. We still have to have respect for those institutions and love, and that can translate into effectiveness in terms of respect and love for the earth and the planet that we reside in.
Tim?
Yeah, so people forget, you say, should the environment be is a part of this election? If you look at the polls, what matters most to you, it's way down there. It's, I don't know, it's in single digits or something like that. I mean, I don't think that adequately conveys the sentiment of the electorate, but people forget so I write history books, and we gave the world this idea of conservation. It was the #1 issue when Teddy Roosevelt was president. I mean, I read all the papers of Roosevelt and his chief forester, Gifford Pinchot. They were establishing national wildlife refuges, national parks, national forests. The whole idea of conservation is something they claim they invented. Now, it's arguable whether they invented it or not, but they did give it a political context. It was the top issue, top 1 or 2 issues in those elections. They made it the top 1 or 2 issues in those elections. So national parks are known as our best idea. We gave it to the world. That was the title of the Ken Burns series on national parks, was our best idea. So it's in the American DNA. It is something, it's not something like it's a niche idea. We gave it a political context a long time ago. And so it's a political context now. Now, I mentioned to you, David, I was at the convention this year in Denver of all the outdoor retailers, which is everyone from REI to Patagonia to people who sell binoculars to the 60 million bird watchers of America, which is how many there are. Extraordinary amount of people. And they're really riled up. They are really, this election is a big deal to them. This was the message they gave me, was because something is being taken away. And that's pretty much how politics works. If something's being taken away from you, you're motivated to act. So my argument would be, it's below the surface right now, but it's certainly out there.
You said earlier your field has been too nice in a way, not demanding political change, and that's actually research finding. The environmental voters projects finds that environmentalists are actually less likely to vote than other people, although they're very active in the community. So there's been some movements around that, right? How do you turn sort of what you're willing to do for the community and for your local area into kind of the voice as a field or voice as a group of people who love nature? And I think there's a lot of potential to that. And when we survey young people, environment is actually the least polarizing issue. So there's a lot of potential there. But it is about sort of how do we make votes relevant for those issues that you're fighting for.
Good answer. Your turn. We have mic runners, and please keep your no statements. Keep it concise.
Someone right there?
To the point, no speech. If you have a hand up here, and then one over here, one over there.
So you all have been talking about how, environmentalism is an easy thing to teach, to inspire. A lot of people, especially young people, can get on board if they are exposed to these experiences. How do you take that to the next step and change that into action, into political action or community action?
That's such an easy question.
It is.
Before you even started, I said, I didn't say this was easy. That's what I was thinking. That part is even difficult to translate to your classroom of, 20 to 50 young people who are, entering the classroom. So even that value piece is difficult. I think the scale question in the civic space is, and this is why we are so polarized, right? It is far easier to galvanize a group of people to act if we vilify 50% of the country and say they are out to destroy us. Or, Pew Research and other research has proven or has backed up the fact that we actually believe, quote, the other side is out to harm the country at this point. So I think the reason why pragmatic action is difficult to take is because it is easier to galvanize people to show up, and activism is going to be on the extreme poles of both the left and the right. So I would say even the smaller part you mentioned was not, quote, easy. I respect every educator out there who's trying to do that work. The next step is more difficult. We really, if we want to get anything done in this particular environment, there has to be a strong group of radically pragmatic people who want to come together, and that has to be attractive. That's a great phrase,
radically pragmatic people. That's great.
Billy?
So I taught last year in Charlottesville, and I was teaching Civil War and science as well. But we didn't talk about what happened in Charlottesville while I was teaching because of fear of the trauma that our students experienced. So could you talk a little bit about when is the right time to engage in these experiences where after a hurricane, when do we start talking about the causes? Or after the KKK descended on my town, when do we start talking about those issues with our students. Thank you.
Can I ask a question back at you? Why didn't you talk about it?
We were not encouraged to by, it's not in our standards, so why would we talk about it?
Because there's our history sprouting right in front of you. I mean, that's, if you don't, that would seem to be an apt time.
I agree, and when we talked about it in our curriculum meetings, it was like, we can't do that right now. We can't talk about that right now.
Tell you what, Judy, let me do a reality check. How much time do we have?
Okay, we have maybe 4 more minutes. Unless, do you want to stay another 5 minutes? Okay, so we now have 8 minutes.
Well, I don't think,
these mathematical
I don't think
things.
there's an easy answer or right answer, and I'm not going to proclaim that, this happens through every single one of you, I'm sure, has had pressure to be silenced. And I think oftentimes teachers are just, students are complaining and you're thinking, I'm with you, I'm oppressed just like you are, and we're barely trying to get by. But I do think we have the opportunity when you're working outside of the classroom. The best teaching oftentimes is not head-on, right? It is reflective practice. And during that time period, the students that we bring to Washington, D.C. from all walks of life through our Leadership in the American Presidency program, ranging from President Trump supporters to Jill Stein supporters, Bernie Sanders supporters, we bring them from east, west, left, right. And we had an experience where we brought them to historic Philadelphia, and obviously had the privilege to be able to be more experiential, and these are more meaningful. But the professor, Gordon Lloyd, who gave them the tour, was very artful in the way he approached it. It was during the time, really thinking about the monuments coming down, and he framed the walk through, why is this important? Who decided it was important and when? And really, as he's going through these historic sites and monuments, he's addressing that very issue, but he never brought it up once. And you could see every single student from their various perspectives learning through that lens. And he had a monument to the first chief naval officer. He's like, why would this monument be here? Well, it was during the time when Irish immigrants were being discriminated against, and this chief naval officer was actually an Irish immigrant. So that group decided to make the funds to put this monument in place. And that's when they decided this was important. We don't teach dissent well in this country. We act like, the founders showed up and there were just a bunch of bobbleheads nodding, all in agreement. When in reality, they had so many disagreements, and not to count the people who walked out, not to count the people who are protesting every single day outside saying, this is a coup, what are you doing to this country? We act like if a law is passed, everyone just was on board. So it's difficult for our young people to go through a time that is polarized, because they don't actually believe that this has happened before, or that they can survive it.
And yet, what has been one of the greatest cultural things to happen in the United States in the last 5 years? Hamilton.
Yeah.
This relatively obscure founder, it became something that everybody connected to. So I'm going to dodge your question real quickly because I don't have an answer, and I want to go back to that first question real quickly because I do have an answer.
Great.
I think one of the ways to move them from initial attachment to action is to give them some ownership, and the way you do that is. I used to make fun of this. You see these adopt a highway thing, and I go, I don't want to adopt a highway, I'll adopt a dog or something, but I don't want to adopt a highway. But in the Northwest, we have these adopt a stream things. So a school will take a little small urban stream and go down there and repair it and watch salmon come back in the spring, and then see the smolts, or salmon come back in the fall and the smolts go out in the spring, and watch the biota come back to life, and it moves them. And then they see there's some construction going on nearby, and it's going to get into the stream. So it moves them a couple layers up the chain from awareness to knowledge. So I've become a big fan of this adopt a TK, because it gives them some ownership in something, and it takes it out of the abstract and puts it into something very real.
Let's do 2 very quick questions. I'll ask the panelists to be brief.
Okay, we have one over there. And I think we have
not had anyone yet. Or you got one over here,
okay.
So we'll do that one.
One over here and one over there. Okay.
Distribute geographically across the room.
We're trying to.
Yeah. So we talk a lot about educating children, and I think about this more and more. My organization teaches K through grade, but mostly kids, but we do adult learners too. And I read The Tipping Point, which I'm sure all 4 of you have read, and You know, we have to get 15% of our society to adopt a new concept to move it into the bell curve, which we have to move into the bell curve, conserving our planet and all the resources. And I'm really stumped. Like, I live in the Houston-Galveston region. We have 7 million people. 15% of 7 million people have to be educated in my region, not kids. We're just talking about people. And I would like to talk about civic engagement in the environment. We can't wait for kids to grow up to save the planet. What do you think?
Let's take our last question over here, take them both, and then we'll make our final comments on them.
Thank you for joining us today. This is a stimulating conversation. So the question is, it may not be an easy one, but we have a really highly transitory country where people are moving back and forth all over the place. So how does that complicate becoming an ecological and or a political citizen of a place, and what could we do about that?
These are two really incredibly easy questions. So let's do this. We're out of time, but can we make our final comments on one or both of those two questions? Okay, you want to go first?
Sure. So one thing I would say, sure, it's really hard to educate 15%. I don't know that number, actually. That's true. However, I think we can't forget the power of kids to educate our adults. We've seen that happen. And they can inspire us all to really change the way we think, because they're not stuck in their own way like we are. So I think that's really important. And then to the other person, thank you for that question. I think it's so true that kind of geographical movement does depress some of the engagement, but that's where technology can actually sometimes help. Some young people are finding an online community where they can really be fully themselves and only online. So we can use both of those things to really create an ecosystem where young people and old people can engage together in a variety of ways. So a little utopian, but.
That's a good answer, thanks. Tim?
Well, on the question of the transitory society, a big jolt in my life was when I moved to Italy with my family. My kids were young and I was writing a book, and we just moved to Italy and, you know, lived for a year in this little villa in the middle of this place where shockingly, the guy that lived below me, you know, their family had been living there for 300 years. And it really changed my view of things, because they really took care of this olive grove. They really took care of this little stream that ran through. And that was about it. I mean, they didn't think in a community sense. They thought of the ownership sense of this small space where Italians have walked, Italians have pressed olive oil out of this place, Italians have made wine from these grapes. And it got me thinking about this, you know, the sort of small view of ownership, you know, that of knowing where you are. And it's very hard in the United States because, I mean, Wendell has this great line about you can't know who you are if you don't know where you are. But most of us don't know where we are, because most of us do move around. We are the most transient society in the history of the world. So it's very difficult to do that.
You know, I think I want to address the question that hasn't been addressed, which is not an easy one, which is, we are running out of time, and these are things that we can't wait for the next generation to solve. But I think as we look to empower the next generation, we are having our young people educate us as well. And I'm sure this has happened for many of you in terms of, you know, parents who have come from different backgrounds and have had different beliefs and having to, you know, change their minds. But again, really emphasizing the fact that this education is a privilege, and the way we impart that knowledge, the messenger is just as important as the message. So how we deliver that message oftentimes can be more, less beneficial than if we hadn't delivered it all. So really thinking about the dignity piece as we deliver a message to make sure that we respect and love country and the environment.
That's a great answer. Great panel. Would you join me in thanking them for great comments?
Thank you all so much, and thank you all for staying just a few more minutes. And let's give David another round of applause for his award. Civic engagement is a critical part of what environmental education is all about, and getting involved in civic life. And thank you for your inspirational thoughts on all of that. We could talk to you forever. They will be here if you want to talk. And also, again, David and Tim will be signing books outside. And just a couple of things besides the book signing after this. We have a wonderful raffle, okay, that we're giving away 2 $500 gift certificates to REI, and free registration next year to Kentucky. And the exhibit fair luncheon is right after this, the affiliate welcome, and the book sale. So thank you all so much. What a stellar panel. Round of applause.